He works at the intersection of the history of science, philosophy, and environmental studies, and has a forthcoming book with Princeton University Press titled The Paranoid Animal: Human Extinction Before the Bomb, which examines how British literary figures, scientists, and social theorists engage with the concept of human extinction prior to the nuclear age. That sounds super interesting, because the history of thinking about human extinction is one of my main research interests over the past many years. So I can't wait for that book to be published. Tyler is also a noted public intellectual whose articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and Jacobin, and he's a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He's one of the few reasons that I'm still kind of on Twitter, as his tweets about politics are a consistent source of insight. So thank you for that. His talk today is titled Silicon Valley's Deep Politics, Species Power, AGI, and the Question of Democracy. So please warmly invite Dr. Harper to the stage, and thank you.
Thank you, Émile. Let's see if I can get this out of here. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and doubly a pleasure to be speaking alongside so many people whose work I've admired and have admired for a long time. So I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you to Émile and Alice for their organizing work to make this symposium happen. In keeping with the theme of the event, my remarks this afternoon will focus on AGI, existential risk, and the question of democracy. Like Émile, I am one of these strange people who does a lot of history but is not a historian. I'm kind of a dilettante historian, but like Émile, I work on the history of the idea of human extinction. I'm going to be talking a bit about that today, but also how that history and the historical ideas about extinction have come to have so much purchase in our contemporary imaginary, particularly in Silicon Valley. So, like I said, I'm going to be focusing on AGI and existential risk in particular as it relates to the question of democracy. It's becoming rapidly clear that artificial intelligence is, as Derrida said, a kind of pharmacon. As others have noted so far, AI hype men and doomsayers alike agree that AGI could either cause or prevent human extinction, depending on how the dice roll. That is, we are told that artificial intelligence is at once the greatest threat to humanity and our only chance at salvation from civilizational scale crises like climate change. And like Émile, I would note the way that these folks use humanity in the human species, I think, is very capacious and should be contested, but I will use that language for shorthand here today. AGI's paradoxical position as both poison and cure within contemporary discourse about existential risk, and particularly the long-termist variety popular in Silicon Valley that reflects the ideological bundle Émile calls tescriel, is a form of neurosis that is simultaneously unique to the 21st century, but is also indebted to and entangled with older strains of technological paranoia and existential dread that stretch back decades and even centuries. For the purpose of this afternoon, I want to set aside debates about whether or not AGI is possible, whether it's possible to build artificial general intelligence, and whether large language models like ChatGPT are the road to get there. For what it's worth, my own private views, I am somewhat skeptical. I tend to think that both promise and panic around AGI is more bubble than Brave New World, and I'm thoroughly unconvinced in particular that large language models will magically secrete intelligence if we simply make them bigger. That to me is magic beans, but you know, who am I to say? I am a mere literary scholar, not a technical expert in large language models. But for what it's worth, that's sort of where I come down on this issue. But either way, this question of whether or not AGI is possible in the near or midterm is certainly important, but it's also in a different way not that interesting to me. So instead of engaging in kind of crass prediction about what may or may not be coming down the pipeline with AGI, I want to focus on the political crisis, or more accurately, the political question that is at the heart of AGI hype and the fears of AI-induced human extinction that form the fog around it. So the question I want to focus on is this: is a politics centered around the creation of AGI and the prevention of human extinction compatible with democracy? Is a politics that takes as its matter of concern the long-term flourishing of the human species, whatever flourishing, and indeed whatever the human species might mean, as we've seen, that's a contested term, is that compatible with democracy? Put another way, is a democratic politics of existential risk and long-term human flourishing possible? put another way still, is democracy as a form of government adequate to preventing human extinction and securing a dignified future for the human species. In a profile of the tech billionaire Peter Thiel in The Atlantic, which Émile generously reminded me of yesterday, the writer Barton Gellman noticed a curious kind of sculpture in Thiel's office that Thiel specially had commissioned by a renowned artist. I tried to get an image of this sculpture, and it does not exist on the internet, but I trust it's perfectly insane. But in the sculpture, there's a sword-wielding hero who looks uncannily like Peter Thiel himself. Oh, thank you. Who looks uncannily like Peter Thiel himself, and this sword-wielding hero is staring down a lion and the dragon. The lion is labeled fair elections, and the dragon is labeled democracy. So Thiel evidently wants to slay both fair elections and democracy, and he basically says as much in this interview with the Atlantic journalist. He repeatedly mentions his lack of faith that philosophy, that democracy can shepherd us to a safe 21st century. So, although Gellman's instinct is right, he's kind of horrified by this sculpture of the sword-wielding Peter Thiel vanquishing the democratic lion and the fair election dragon. He kind of misses a reference that it's very obvious that Thiel is making here. So Thiel, for all his many and numerous faults, is legitimately well steeped in German philosophy, and he's an avid reader of Nietzsche in particular. The lion and the dragon in this sculpture that Thiel has commissioned is very explicitly a reference that Gellman doesn't pick up on to a parable from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. In the parable, Nietzsche imagines a lion confronting a dragon, who the philosopher identifies with civilization's old values. Nietzsche says, the dragon is thou shalt. The dragon demands we do things as they always have been done. And in this parable, Nietzsche says the lion enters the wilderness, but this dragon stands in his way. This thou shalt prevents the lion from going where he wants to go. Nietzsche writes, the dragon, sparkling with gold, a scale-covered beast, and on every scale glittereth golden, thou shalt. The values of 1,000 years glitter on those scales. Nietzsche says the lion represents something like the will to refuse the status quo, to reject everything that came before. The dragon demands, thou shalt, or you will, and the lion says, I will not, I shall not. So the lion is strong. Nietzsche makes a point of this. The lion can kill the dragon, but that's all the lion can do. It can do away with the old civilization. It can say, I will not, but it won't put anything new in its place. The lion rejects the past and the old world without having a substantive vision of the future is the point of this parable. So what replaces the lion? This is where the parable gets interesting. Nietzsche ends the parable by saying, just like the dragon, the lion also has to be vanquished. And what is replaced by the lion is not an even stronger beast, but a child. What can the child do, which even the lion could not, Nietzsche asks. Why hath the lion, become a child? The philosopher answers this question himself. He says, innocence is the child, and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a game, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a holy yes. Yes, for the game, my brethren, is creation. There is needed a holy yes unto life, and life is capitalized here. Its own willeth now the spirit his own world. So the child is the hero in Nietzsche's parable because only the child, who represents the future or the fundamentally new, is able to create new values, to destroy the dragon and design a new system, to not simply reject what came before, but to create something novel in its place. And this is a kind of cosmic dice roll, Nietzsche says explicitly. And as we're thinking, as Émile and others have sort of explained, the way people like Elon Musk and Thiel talk about AGI is it might kill us, but we have to do it. It's the cosmic dice roll that we have to take. And this is how Nietzsche's parable, which Thiel is very obviously referencing here, explicitly ends. The child says yes to life, to the species is one way of thinking about that, and to the creation of a new world. So isn't this more or less how tech billionaires think about AGI? tech billionaires in particular, who are worried about the threat of human extinction. They see themselves as Nietzsche's child, as defending the future of life and the creation of a new world. They see themselves as people who will not simply tear down the old civilization, but will build a better one in its place. And as they rush to build AGI, a technology which, again, they insist could either save the world or destroy it, they do not ask the permission of people or a government, right? Governments, democratically elected governments, are the dragon that Thiel wants to get past. This old set of values he no longer believes in. Their vision is resolutely anti-democratic. Thiel's is explicitly anti-democratic, I think that's clear, but so is the vision of Elon Musk and other people in this AGI space who really don't see democracy as adequate to preventing human extinction. So in a post-AGI era, the vision we have here is one of a new sovereign, in which the sovereign will not be the president of a democratically elected country, and the sovereign will not even be the king of a new monarchy, but the sovereign will be the CEO of an AI tech startup. Right? That's the vision that is on offer here. And what Musk and Thiel and all of these folks are competing for is who gets to be the sovereign, more or less, is one way to think about what's going on. So that is Thiel's vision, explicitly contained in this bizarre sculpture of him fighting the dragon and lion, and it's the implicit vision of many others as well. Yet if we find this anti-democratic view odious, and I think most of us in this room, including myself, do find it odious, people like Thiel are also pointing to an open question that I think we are too habituated to politely ignore. And that question is, can democracies get their shit together enough to save the world? Or is democracy as a form of governance inadequate to the task of pulling humanity and the planet it inhabits back from the brink? In other words, are extra-democratic mechanisms necessary to prevent near or long-term human extinction? This is an ugly question, but it's one that I think we need to take seriously, and not simply because very powerful billionaires obviously take it seriously. We cannot take for granted that democratic societies are capable of securing a safe human future. We exist in a moment of spiraling climate change, proxy wars between nuclear powers, and a new technological arms race as massive corporations jockey for AI supremacy and the absence of any government intervention by democratic governments. If authoritarian governments like Russia and China have certainly played their role in shaping our dimming civilizational prospects, it's equally clear that democratic societies have not only failed to confront, but have actively exacerbated many of the key risks to the survival of the human species today. Looking out on the third decade of the 21st century, as disasters around the world accumulate, world leaders trade thermonuclear barbs, and democratically elected politicians claim the government controls hurricanes, it's really difficult to say with any confidence that existing democracies are up to saving our species from ruin. So the question, can democracies prevent human extinction, is obviously not one we can answer this afternoon, but I want to sketch out the conceptual groundwork necessary to begin thinking about what an answer would look like. Specifically, I want to introduce the unspoken assumptions, and there are three of them, that I think are circulating in the background of much discussion of existential risk, and especially the existential risk that's allegedly posed by AI. And these are some ideas under different kinds of names we've heard introduced throughout the symposium over the last day or so, but they're lurking in the background here. The first assumption made by the AGI and existential risk crowd is that it's possible to wield what I call species power. By species power, I mean a form of what Foucault would have called biopower, centered not on controlling the health of populations or nation states as it was originally imagined, but a form of power that aims to control the health and trajectory of the human species as a biological form. So the second assumption is that what I call deep politics is possible. By deep politics, I mean a form of political activity that is directed toward extremely long-term goals. Goals for the species and not individuals or nation states that are measured not in years or even decades, but in centuries, millennia, and beyond. The third assumption that undergirds much discussion of AI and X risk is a version of the transhumanist thesis, one Émile was speaking about earlier, right? This hatred of humanity. Émile pointed this out. I think this is totally correct. No matter how much they talk about the need to save the human species and save humanity, they're not talking about us. They're not talking about the actually existing human species. They're talking about this digital paradise of milk and honey and minds uploaded to computers. And so there is what I refer to as in some of my public writing, the new misanthropy, which is this idea that we have a duty to usher in our digital successors, even if that means our own obsolescence. So, before considering these concepts individually, species power, deep politics, and this new misanthropy, I'm going to take just a stab at kind of integrating them or showing how these ideas connect. Species power, the power to control the evolutionary trajectory of our species, and even, as in the case of AGI, to claim the right to create new species, is the form of power on which deep politics rests, right? Any deep politics proposes the right to make decisions on behalf of the future of the human species. And Silicon Valley's AI-fueled misanthropy insists that it is our species' duty to transcend ourselves to enter into a digital post-humanity. This idea, this misanthropy, right, which they paint as a love for the human, but is precisely the opposite, is the moral legitimation for their deep politics. It's the moral legitimation for wielding species power. We need to make these decisions that are extra democratic because there is a moral demand that we usher in this digital Valhalla of 10 to the 58, whatever it is, future lives in computers. So, like Torres, my work is focused really on the history of the idea of extinction. I work between philosophy, literature, and the history of science largely. And so I want to think a bit about the way in which deep politics is really an iteration of Darwinism, or at least the versions of deep politics we see on offer today are deeply enmeshed in Darwinian ways of thinking. As Douglas Rushkoff observed yesterday, the bedrock view that undergirds the Silicon Valley worldview, what he calls the mindset, is really just a version of Darwinism, a particularly coarse version, I would add. And it's absolutely crucial to the emergence of the deep politics problematic. So, although we don't typically talk about Darwinism in these terms, Darwinian biology is essentially a kind of nihilistic biology, one that asserts there's no purpose, all species are vulnerable to extinction, there's no forward march of evolutionary progress, only the chaos of competition. So Darwin's biology was a key intellectual force that helped shape early thinking about deep politics in the 19th century, and that still lurks in the background of existential risk discourse today. So I want to sketch out some of this Darwinian underbelly before turning to the question of species power as a new kind of sovereignty. Because reckoning with species power as a question of sovereignty, I think, is really important to getting at what is the anti-democratic nature of what's happening in Silicon Valley, and trying to answer the question, is there a different politics that might help secure a human future that is less odious than what we have on offer? So in the second half of this talk today, I'm specifically going to focus on the importance of distinguishing species power from biopower in Foucault's original sense. Foucault gestures toward this in various ways, and Foucault often invokes the species, but he does so in a really sloppy way. And one of the things I'm going to point out at the end today is that this slipperiness in Foucault between biopower exercised over the species and biopower exercised over populations by nation states prevents us and sort of mystifies the problem of power that we're dealing with when we're talking about what's going on in Silicon Valley. So Foucault gets us part of the way there, but we also need to tease out some tension in his thinking, which is how I'll wrap up today. But deep politics. As a politics concerned first and foremost with the future and even the far future of the human species, deep politics became intelligible the moment it became possible to consider the species as a distinct and separate political entity, exposed to unique threats such as degeneration and extinction, and is susceptible to political management, organization, and control. The idea that the human species is something that can be programmatically and politically managed is a relatively recent idea, right? It's one that is very familiar to us now, but that has not been with us for very long. So deep politics exists as a form of what the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk calls anthropo-technological thinking, predicated on the notion that the human, not as an individual, but as a biological type, can be the site of a new political techne. The deep in deep politics signals the fact that a politics concerned with the human species as species must also be a politics that takes the measure of geological and biological deep time. The fact that the human species is a product of massive spatiotemporally extended stochastic processes and is opposed to conventional politics or shallow politics in this way, particularly of the democratic variety. Democratic politics are by their nature shallow, right? They turn on the time of the election cycle, and they're oriented toward much briefer horizons, right? Which is one of the reasons why climate change has posed such a challenge, even as many of us are deeply concerned about it. But this isn't a future prospect, deep politics. Deep politics is already here in important ways. When we are trying to figure out what to do with nuclear waste that has to be stored for 20,000 years, and that will be around very likely even when our civilization is gone, that is a deep political question, right? That is occurring outside the frame, outside of a democratic frame. When Elon Musk declares that his only goal is to make the species multiplanetary, that's a deep political project. SpaceX is a deep political company in its quest to colonize and terraform Mars, and it goes without saying that AGI is also deeply political. It's a technology that aims to usher in a new digital millennium. So what I'm trying to highlight here is that there is this temporal disjunction between democratic politics and politics concerned with these extremely long-term human questions. And I think the question at hand that the Silicon Valley folks are saying no to is, can long-term politics concerned with these long-term questions be prosecuted in a way that is democratic? Their answer is no. And I think what's on the table is whether or not that's the right answer. And if so, who should we side with? Democracy or this question of long-term futurity? So we can trace a lot of this to Darwin and his, what I've referred to as his nihilistic biology. There is this fairy tale about Darwin, which is that Darwin debased man. Darwin comes along and says, you guys are all descended from monkeys. We are an animal among other animals. There's this notion, I come from environmental studies, and this is common in environmental studies. The fairy tale that we tell about Darwin is that Darwin disabused us of our anthropocentrism, right? We no longer saw ourselves as the center of the universe, but as a being among other kinds of beings that is prey to the same kind of natural processes and evolutionary moves as other kinds of entities. And there is something to that, but I also think that narrative, that kind of fairy tale about Darwinism and disabusing us of anthropocentrism, doesn't get at the sort of dark counter image of Darwinism that we also got in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. So while people like Lawrence Buell are no doubt correct when they point out that Darwin's demotion of the human species to a monkey did a great deal to disabuse us of some of these anthropocentric attitudes, early forms of political Darwinism in Victorian England were often explicitly predicated on the notion that insofar as evolutionary biology posited species as vulnerable to hostile nature, traditional political thinking needed to be rewired in order to accommodate, to operate on an evolutionarily sound basis. The most famous iteration in the 19th century of this, of course, is eugenics as a project, which was explicitly about making politics compatible with a vision of evolutionary health, a dark vision, it goes without saying. But far from displacing this attitude of anthropocentrism, I argue that it actually caused many of us to double down on it. And this double down anthropocentrism is what we see in Silicon Valley. It's helped establish a worldview or an attitude that I've referred to elsewhere as paranoid anthropocentrism. The notion that if the place of the human species in the great chain of being is no longer guaranteed by a divine or natural order, then it is up to us to secure our own conditions of existential security, right? So what I'm trying to get at is some people read Darwin and say, we are just like other beings. The human is not the center of the cosmos. We are not special, right? We have not been created by a divine force. Other people read this as ushering us into a state of emergency. If we are not, if there is nothing in nature that is going to secure our survival, then it is up to us to do so, right? Then it is up to us to create a politics that will secure our survival if God or nature itself isn't going to will our permanence. So in the decades leading up to the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, various ideas about evolution competed for scientific legitimacy. When Darwin's work burst on the scene in 1859, what was revolutionary was not really the premise that life forms evolved. Others had suggested this as well, like Lamarck, Robert Chambers, and so on. Rather, his innovation was introducing an argument for evolution in which design played no determining role. As Peter Bowler put it, the challenge of Darwinism was that it turned nature into an amoral chaos, showing no evidence of design by a creator. In contrast, most theories up to Darwin had presumed that evolution worked toward future goals rather than mechanistic laws that governed the evolutionary process. So Darwin's vision, predicated on random variation in environmental circumstance, coupled with his depiction of evolution as a hostile struggle rather than peaceful refinement. And I would agree with Douglas that I think you can read Darwin as very interested in cooperation, right? But that is not how Darwin gets habituated in the Western context. So I am on board with the optimistic Darwin. However, it is not the one that got metabolized, I think, by most folks, unfortunately. So in my view, Darwin opens the door to deep political thinking, and this is largely a function of his nihilistic biology that it's grounded upon. Put succinctly, that biological nihilism can be understood in the light of three principal factors that, while not necessarily unique to Darwinism individually, were extraordinarily radical in combination. Those factors are as follows. The notion that species are ontologically precarious, right? That there is no reason a species should be rather than not be. Any given species is an accidental rather than essential feature of nature. Species do not represent the expression of a transcendental archetype, right? Darwin rejects a kind of Platonist understanding of biology. To talk about a species is really to employ a kind of shorthand for an organism sharing traits sufficiently similar to facilitate reproduction, and that is bereft of any kind of unchanging essence, right? Another way to say this is that species are metastable. They're not eternal. They remain in constant flux. And the third is that species are a product of environmental circumstance and random variation rather than design. So there's no reason a species should be one way rather than another. And the current form of a species is just a result of temporally extended stochastic processes, right? This is a deeply nihilistic view, and I don't mean nihilistic in a judgmental way. I mean it in the sense that it strips biology and evolution of meaning in a transcendental sense, right? And it is into that vacuum of meaning that deep politics rushes, particularly the kind that we see today, right? And I think this connects back to Émile's point about the fundamentally religious nature of the kind of politics we have on offer in Silicon Valley. So far, I've framed deep politics as a political view in which the welfare of the human species figures as the overriding political concern, in which the species is considered the site of an existential risk that can be rationally strategized against. Furthermore, I pointed out that this nihilism endemic to Darwinian biology clears the way to deep politics by showing that the human species is in perennial danger. Any species could be or not be. There's no reason we have to be here permanently. Also, that a species is a conjugation of processes occurring across a vast time scale, right? So the horizon for a species is very temporally extended. And finally, the direction of this process is neither preordained, progressive, or purposeful. So Darwin made it possible to see the human species as the site of a potential problem, i.e. we could go extinct, but also he pointed the way toward a potential solution. Because if our species is ever changing and that change is not hardwired into the evolutionary process, then it might be possible to wield species power. We might be able to direct our future in some kind of way. Then it might be possible to direct politics not in the service of protecting a population or a nation or even a civilization, but toward the project of protecting the species. And so in the 19th century, as I've said, this species power primarily takes the form of eugenics, but over the course of the 20th and 21st century, it begins to take new forms that we see in the test realist movement, which obviously has its own overlaps with eugenics as well. But what I'm trying to get at here, the reason Darwin is so important and why he opens up such a crack in our thinking about long-term strategies for the human species, is that Darwin identifies that extinction occurs through these relatively anticipatable processes, right? Devolution, environmental change, interspecies competition. And if we know how extinction generally happens, then it becomes possible to strategize in advance against it, right? And that is a deep political project, as I've been saying. So Darwin cracks open this door, and it's worth noting, Émile's book on this is really excellent. There is a long history of thinking about human extinction as a kind of political problem that can be strategized against. But I think Darwin makes a concerted kind of thinking across the Anglosphere really legible for the first time. But I think it's Foucault who provides the theorization for a lot of what is inchoate in these post-Darwinian politics that emerge over the course of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. So the philosopher's work on biopower, as I mentioned, I think ultimately fails because it doesn't distinguish biopower from what I refer to as species power. But he lays the groundwork for making that distinction and for coming to understand species power, right? Any use of power to direct the future of the human species as fundamentally anti-democratic. And it's this model of anti-democratic sovereignty over the species that is at the heart of Silicon Valley's AGI push. So Foucault first mentions biopower in his 1976 lecture at the College of France, as well as in the first volume of The History of Sexuality that gets published that same year, where biopower is explicitly identified as a new mode of sovereignty predicated on, quote, the calculated management of life. And in these works, and in his 1976 lecture, Society Must Be Defended in particular, Foucault traces the birth of a new model of power that is not predicated on individualizing modes of discipline, as he puts it, but rather on what he says massifying, an idiom of control not exercised over discrete lives, but rather over life itself. In an often cited passage that I'm sure is familiar to many of us, outlining the broad historical contours of this shift, Foucault declares, and I think that one of the greatest transformations political right underwent in the 19th century was precisely that. I wouldn't say exactly that sovereignty's old right to take life or let live was replaced, but it came to be complemented by a new right, which does not erase the old right, but which does penetrate it, permeate it. It is the power to make live and let die. So what Foucault is outlining is a power of a mode of sovereignty that's not predicated on the right to kill, what he refers to often as the right of the sword, but instead on the capacity to enforce particular regimes of living and to decide the logics of inclusion, exclusion that determine who does not merit participation in these regimes. So emphasizing the non-individualizing thrust of this power, he goes on to say that biopower is targeted at, quote, the living man, the man as a living being, ultimately, if you like, to man as species. And he concludes by this passage by figuring biopower as, quote, a new technology that is being established to address the multiplicity of man, a global mass that is affected by overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and so on. We have power that is not individualizing, but if you like, massifying, that is not directed toward man as body, but man as species. This is nothing less than a biopolitics of the human race. And here we begin to encounter what Foucault calls the last domain of biopolitics. He frames biopolitics as almost being on a kind of scale. And at the far end of that scale is what he says, what he calls control over relations between the human race or human beings insofar as they are a species, insofar as they are living beings. And it's here that I think we start to see the muddiness I'm referring to in Foucault's thinking that I think is really important to disentangle to get a glimpse as to what is happening in Silicon Valley and how species power is different from these other and older forms of biopower. So he uses the term the human race, human beings insofar as they are a species, the human population, the human as living beings, interchangeably, right? These are different, these connote different things, right? A human population, the population of a nation state is different than the human species. But for some reason, Foucault uses them interchangeably throughout. And although he points out that that biopower is a model of power that massifies men into the species man, as he puts it, that takes the measure of man as a biological type, it's clear that species is sort of an empty term for him. Again, he's using it as a synonym for these other kinds of terms, right? Man as a species, man as an animal, man as the bearer of biological functions. These are treated as interchangeable. And it's really clear that they're not. We can see ways in which those things don't reduce down to one another. So biopower, in Foucault's formulation, is supposedly a power concerned with the human species in that it's power attentive to our biological functions. However, the extent to which he thinks rigorously about the human species as a political project, I think, is really, really questionable, as becomes more apparent in his lectures the following year. So in his subsequent lectures, he deepens these reflections on species, power, and biology. He says, I would like to begin studying something that I've called, somewhat vaguely, biopower. He explains on the first day of his security, territory, and population lectures. He says, by this I mean the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species became the object of a political strategy, of a general strategy of power. And this emergent strategy of power, in Foucault's account, is not predicated on modes of disciplinary organization or the docility of bodies, but is instead predicated on technologies of security designed to manage risks that are a priori, baked into the real, risks that are not eradicable but manageable, containable, capable of being reckoned with through political strategy. Security works on a given, he says. It is simply a matter of maximizing the positive elements for which one provides the best circulation and of minimizing what is risky and inconvenient, like theft and disease, while knowing that they will never be completely suppressed. One will therefore work not only on a natural given, but on a quantity that can't be relatively but never wholly reduced. So what he's trying to get at here is the problem that biopower is attentive to is a permanent problem. Right? That there are biological features of the human being, the fact that we live and die, that we are vulnerable to disease and so on, that can't be eradicated but must be perpetually managed, right? And this idea of perpetual management, or the human being or the human species, as the site of what I often call a permanent emergency, right? We are always vulnerable to extinction, and therefore we must maintain constant paranoid vigilance, is at the heart of this notion of biopower. But again, this notion of species versus population remains extremely, extremely slippery here. So throughout these lectures, Foucault is clear that biopower is a mode of power aimed at securing the integrity of a specific population through strategic mechanisms that take account of the biological nature of human beings. This is another way of saying that biopower conceives of population not as a collection of subjects who are meant to be bent to the will of a sovereign, but instead as a collection of human animals, population as a set of organisms governed by specific biological features that can't be eradicated, and that sovereignty can't change, but must simply accept with, work around, etc. Foucault refers to this new outlook as the entry of nature into the field of techniques as of power. So no longer is sovereignty understood as will directed toward human beings who are conceived as waiting clay, who will just do what the sovereign wants, but instead the sovereign confronts, quote, a population whose nature is such that the sovereign must deploy procedures of government within this nature with the help of it and with regard to it. So simply put, the people over which sovereignty exercises power are not conceived of as a blank slate, and instead the population, people as population, are conceived as a mass where these a priori laws that are biological, like vulnerability to extinction and disease, reside and rule. In a lengthy but crucial passage, he says, the dimension in which the population is immersed among other living beings appears and is sanctioned when, for the first time, men are no longer called mankind, le genre humain, excuse my terrible French, and begin to be called the human species, l'espèce humaine. With the emergence of mankind as a species, within the definition of all living species, we can say that man appears in the first form of his integration with biology. From one distinction, then, population is the human species, and from another, it is what we will call the public. The population seen under the aspect of its opinions, ways of doing things, forms of behavior, customs, fears, etc. The population is therefore everything that extends from biological rootedness through to the species up to the surface that gives hold and is provided by the public. From the species to the population, we have here a whole new field of realities in the sense that they are pertinent to mechanisms of power. And it's this shift from population to species, from humankind, from humanity to the human species, that is the object that power must confront, Foucault says, and that begins to come to fruition during the 19th century. He says this conclusion is inescapable. If the population is the human species, and if biopower is power with an eye to population, then biopower is in a certain sense always already power directed at the species. And this is an assumption that I think doesn't hold, and this is what I've been trying to drive at. I think we need to be able to make distinctions between power, biopower aimed at populations, and power that is aimed at making decisions on behalf of the species as such, right? These are different aims, and they presuppose different models as sovereignty. So we cannot treat species and population as interchangeable terms. This is far too slippery and ultimately too sloppy. Population and species do not mean the same thing, and the kinds of power that might be wielded over them is different in kind. This becomes apparent when we consider the relationship between biopower and sovereignty. So Foucault's core claim is that biopower is a mode of power exercised by modern democratic nation states in particular, right? That biopower is the kind of power that emerges when modern democratic nation states come to the forefront of governance, and to invoke their sovereignty by controlling the biological populations that find themselves within their borders, right? So biopower is a project that is proper to the modern democratic state. The reason we need to be able to distinguish biopower from species power is that it is apparent that what is good for the population of a nation state might not be good for the population of the human species as a whole. So to use a trivial example, and a topical example, not trivial, were NATO and the United States to begin directly fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia, or Russia on behalf of Ukraine, that would be good for the health of the Ukrainian population. But the risk of nuclear war with Russia might prove quite unhealthy for the population of the human species. It is clear in that example that biopower, the right of a sovereign to make decisions on behalf of a population, and species power, the right of a sovereign to make decisions that impact the human species as a species, are different modes of power with different objects and different aims and scales of implementation. Foucault's work, even as it points to the possibility of theorizing species power, also tends to mystify this distinction, and it's one that I think we need to demystify. For if biopower can be wielded democratically by democratically elected politicians who voters have tasked with the responsibility of governing a nation state's population, pardon me, species power is inherently anti-democratic, and this is what I want to get at. The species, after all, cannot vote. In fact, even if you were to imagine an alternate universe in which the whole human population fell under the umbrella of a single democratically elected government, and every human being on Earth were given the right to vote, exercising species power would still be anti-democratic, because the species is more than the collection of individuals at any one given time. It's temporally extended. So, after all, what right do human beings here and now have to make decisions that will impact future generations that are not yet born and have no say? This is, of course, the key challenge of climate change. Climate politics, after all, are a form of species politics. The need of currently existing human beings, many of them living in democratic societies, are balanced against the needs of future humans who have not yet been born, and indeed against the survival of the human species as a whole. So what I'm trying to get at is that we need to confront the idea and the fact, uncomfortable as it is, that a deep politics centered around the wielding of species power, in other words, a politics concerned with securing the long-term survival of the human species, can't be purely democratic. But it is also clear that there are better and worse forms of species power, just as, and there are more and less just forms of deep politics. At this moment, Silicon Valley billionaires claim the right to wield species power, claim the right to make decisions, whether or not to develop AGI, for example, that will shape the future of the species, and indeed whether the species has a future at all. And they are doing it without our consent. So I am personally of the opinion that preventing human extinction is the most profound challenge we will face in the 21st century. I am not especially concerned about AGI, but I am concerned about things like nuclear proliferation, climate change, and so on. But I do agree with the terrestrial billionaires on this one and very narrow point, and this is a place where Émile and I might differ. And that is, I do think we have some measure of responsibility to preserve the light of consciousness in a cosmos that might otherwise be dark. I think that is a moral claim you can make that I think is a coherent one. But it seems to me that the task before us today, for those of us who care about democracy and who care about preventing human extinction, is how to balance the demands of democracy with the moral mandate to ensure our species' survival. As I've been saying, I don't think we can assume, and if we look at the available evidence, it's not quite clear that actually existing democracies are up to the task of providing a livable future. So what do we do with that if we have these competing moral mandates, ensure the survival of democracy, and ensure the survival of the species? So the question we need to ask, in my view, is what would a maximally democratic deep politics look like? What would a maximally democratic form of species power look like? And what kind of people, governments, or organizations do we want wielding that power? For my part, the answer is obviously not Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and their ilk, who do not dream of a human future but a post-human future, a deeply misanthropic view in which everything that makes human beings distinct as a form of life is to be engineered away on the road to a digital land of milk and honey. Okay, I've said too much. Thank you all so much. I'll look forward to questions and talking with Émile.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you from the floor. I'm just following the logic of your Sorry.
Do you want a mic?
No, I don't think I don't. Should I use the mic? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it so much that I had a question immediately. So I was listening to you, your really helpful distinction between Foucauldian biopower and species power, and then your development of the idea of a temporal logic, and the things you said about long-termism in the Silicon Valley, sort of its appeal for these ideologies seemed right, but a central claim of the talk was that it was democracy with its short-term election cycles, which isn't capable of accommodating the longer time span of species power. And I really have a question about that, whether we're thinking just of democracy as it's embodied in roughly liberal capitalism or other forms of capitalism, because I'm pretty persuaded of arguments that talk about ecological pathologies of capitalism that have to do with misfit temporalities. Yeah. But I would need an argument for why you couldn't have a longer term conversation in a demos that wasn't embodied in a capitalist society.
Yeah, so I would agree with you. First of all, is the first thing I would say. I would distinguish. So I'm raising two questions. One is if actually existing democracies are adequate to preventing human extinction. Right now, the answer seems to be is very unclear. Right, there's been next to no regulation of AGI. One of the reasons being is that we're trying to beat China, and our national interests are, sort of supervening what might be the good of the species in that way. Likewise, there are unpopular wars. Two of them right now unfolding. Governments have not really changed their behavior despite what the public might think about them. Climate change, likewise, many people are worried about climate change and we're not doing anything about it. So I think there's this open question about actually existing Western democracies as we have them. And that's one I'm trying to raise. Now, the second conceptual point I'm trying to get at is I do think long-term projects concerned with directing human futures are inherently anti-democratic. The reason being is that the human species is temporally extended. There are people here right now. There is a human extinction movement that is slowly growing. There are plenty of people who don't think our species has a right to exist, that we're predatory and a drain on the planet. Right. Likewise, there are many different competing visions of human futures. How are we to say what people in a distant future might want their life to look like? Right. And we are making decisions on their behalf at this very moment. Right. I think that's at its core anti-democratic, and I don't mean that as a value judgment, right? I think combating climate change means doing things that are probably anti-democratic, that don't have the consent of the future, right? Because we can't get it. But I'm trying to point out that I think formally, this is what the Silicon Valley people are recognizing, that there is no way to get consent for species power or to get consent for a single vision of deep politics, and it just has to be seized. That's the wager they seem to have. And my question is, what do we do with that, right? And so I think, these are two competing value systems. I think, like I said, there's a moral claim that we should try to prevent human extinction. I think there's a strong moral claim that democracy is the best form of government available, although the kind we have in a capitalist society is not so great, right? But these two claims, these two moral aims might be at tension, is what I'm trying to point out. And we need to figure out how to balance those and what we care about. And this isn't just a conceptual point. I mean, if you look at the conflict in Ukraine right now, the argument at its core is that we must risk nuclear confrontation with Russia to save democracy, right? So this is, at this moment, a place where we can see this conflict between biopower democracy and the health of the species at a crossroads, right? And the wager we're making is that it is worth the risk, right? But how do we decide that? And so really the point I'm trying to draw is there is a tension here, one we often want to overlook because it's an ugly tension, and that other people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere are not overlooking it. And so we just need to take it seriously and have a conversation about what do we do,
Great, thanks. Yes. Yes, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much.
So, yeah, part of what I understood Alice to be getting at, maybe, was that aren't polities also temporally extended? So you would need more than temporal extension to be a distinguishing thing between democratic or not.
Sure.
There are obviously different levels of temporal extension, but if we are going to break out a 4-year time span for thinking about what it means to govern and make decisions together, then we would also need to be thinking and making decisions that are temporally extended. So I wonder whether, if temporal extension, I heard you in part saying, is something that prevents a form of power from being democratic, then wouldn't that also hold for the nation state? But that actually wasn't my main question.
Oh, sure.
Sorry, I had another one. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Partly. So I was saying yes, and then we got deeper into your account of Foucault, and then I thought, So Foucault is looking at kind of modern, seemingly democratic nation states, and part of what he's doing is also showing how biopower and sovereign power come together in, say, fascism.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And this is not because for him they're completely different in kind, but share some kind of general features or assumptions around, for him, trying to promote the health and life of a particular group over and against any kind of perceived threat to their survival and existence, right? And so for him, biopower is essentially racist. It's part of his.
Explicit.
So, and that is built into the structure, whether it's clear in exceptional case or not, into the structure of, therefore, as I said, of biopower and the kind of seemingly even kind of more democratic nation states. But certain things such as, he argues Nazi Germany kind of make that logic and the kind of, the possible annihilatory logic, like, clear. So I just wanted to kind of add that because it complicates, I think, a little bit the reading you were giving of him and the kind of, the power.
No, it's a really great question. I mean, the first thing I would say on the racism point is you're absolutely right that he argues that racism is core to biopower, but he defines racism in a really idiosyncratic way, which is not only, or at least not exclusively, about race as we would think of it, but also race in the sense of making decisions about who is an in-group and an out-group, right? And so the way he talks about racism isn't the way we use racism in the vernacular, but is this process of decision, right? Like who lives and who dies, who is in and who is out. That is the kind of racism he's getting at, and I think it's dislocated a little bit from racism as a thinking about like whiteness or blackness. Or,
he talks about like Nazi Germany.
No, for sure. But I mean, that's an instance of the broader thing, which is racism as making distinctions between who lives and who dies that might not map exactly onto how we think about racism in the vernacular.
Or democracy.
Or democracy, yeah. But in terms of the question of the state, right, he's obviously not saying that democratic states are the only states that exercise biopower. He talks about fascism a great deal. The point I'm trying to get at is that biopower is compatible with democracy, right? Like democratically elected governments exercise biopower all the time, right? And so what I'm trying to get at is species power is something different. And this kind of circles back to your point about temporal extension. What's crucial for me is not simply that the temporal extension, although that's really important, it's the ontological question about making decisions on behalf of the non-existent, right? That to me is what is inherent, the anti-democratic core, and maybe anti-democratic isn't the right word, right? Maybe we would want a different terminology for that. But my point is that deep politics that are concerned with the far future, that are concerned with ushering in the future of human life, making decisions about whether we will merge with a digital humanity, right? These are decisions on behalf of people who do not yet exist, right? And so how do you do that democratically? That's not only is that a different temporal orientation, but that's a different kind of ontological problem than what you have with biopower, I think.
Isn't that, okay, so just one, isn't that also true for like reproductive strategies that target,
Yes, absolutely. I think that's 100%.
You're integral to biopower on Foucault's now.
Yes, yeah, I think that's definitely true. Yes.
So,
Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Are you gonna throw it? Sorry, is that Jen in that order or?
Can I give it
You
to
go
you?
first.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So I will start with like what you said about Darwin. It's, maybe disenchanting the species and nature from some kind of usual narrative of the divine.
Yep.
But the fact that this hole that is left creates the paranoia for a kind of species security meant something like religion in the past gave that sort of security as if, right, origin stories and myths from religion served as some kind of deep politics that had a retrospective futurity that justified existing social structures from the point of view of a creation, right? And I guess that seems like the logic with longtermism, right? Something like here, humanity is essentially defined as, the receptacle of the,
Value.
welfare and that needs to be multiplied, right? It seems like, they're working essentially in the same way, which, right, I guess the first question would be like, does that sound right to you? And second, right, then if religion can be considered a form of deep politics, I guess I started to wonder, is deep politics even politics? Right, in a sense, right, I guess, I guess one of the things about this talk, right, is that we haven't defined politics. Right? We talk about forms of democracy and anti-democratic practices, but right, the goal of what politics does, like what forms it has, what goes, like the teleology of, like, those are sort of stuff that we haven't talked about. So just wondering what your thoughts on that is.
Yeah, so the religious question you bring up is really important and really interesting. And whether or not religions count as deep politics, I think, is one I'd have to think more about before I'd want to say confidently one way or the other. But I do think there's something distinct I'm trying to get at that starts to happen in the 19th century, which is that the human species begins to be seen as something that can be rationally managed, right? That there are a specific set of problems that it's vulnerable to, that Darwin makes legible in a certain kind of way, about which we can do something, right? So, I mean, a key part of the sort of shift around thinking about extinction in the 19th century is that the sort of first substantive thinking about extinction comes from Georges Cuvier, the French comparative anatomist, who has this catastrophic model of geology, which says extinction happens through these giant global upheavals that snuff species out, right? That is essentially a tragic conception of human extinction, or extinction. Cuvier wasn't talking about human extinction, but it's a tragic conception, right? Because if extinction happens because the sun blinks out, as in romantic poetry, or because of large global upheavals, there's nothing we can do about that, right? We just have to wait our turn. But what Darwin comes along and says, he revises Cuvier and says, that's all wrong. Extinction does not happen from these giant global upheavals, but rather from these mundane, very slow processes, interspecies competition, environmental change, so on and so forth. And in doing that, extinction's no longer tragic, right? Because he identifies processes by which extinction is, we can anticipate it might happen, and then it becomes possible to strategize in advance in a kind of rational way against them. That was not the case on a catastrophic model, which you just kind of have to wait and die, right? I mean, if you look at, early 19th century images of human extinction, they're all just like a guy looking at a sun that's dying and he's going like this, right? The idea is that we're helpless. And after Darwin, and it's not just Darwin, but Darwin's really important here, it becomes possible to think about the species as a political project with predictable challenges that can be managed in a way that's rational. And I think there's something slightly different to that than whatever kind of deep politics we get in religion, although I think you're right that there's some overlap, and that there's certainly in the attempt to paradise engineer, right, I think there's certainly something religious to this project. It's a way of giving humans meaning in a cosmos from which God is absent, right? But that's a really good question. And to your last point, what do we mean by politics? Just in the most capacious way here, I mean, if we think about politics as a strategy for securing goals that are not given to us naturally in the state of nature, right? I mean, that's what the deep politics is here, right? What Darwin made clear is that our survival is not baked in. For a really long time, naturalists and scientists even debated whether extinction was possible, of any kind, right? Because it violated God's plan. Why would God create something only for it to go extinct, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So when extinction becomes possible, it kind of pulls the, metaphysically or in terms of meaning, pulls the ground out from under us, right? Where this is no longer guaranteed. Survival of our species isn't guaranteed by the state of nature, and therefore we need some kind of politics to try to secure it, right? That is what I think comes out of Darwin, and I think that's at the bedrock of, like I said, what I refer to as the kind of paranoid anthropocentrism we have at Silicon Valley, which is that it's paranoid, right? Because we're the site of a permanent emergency, we could go extinct, and it's anthropocentric insofar as it wants to will the human into the deep, deep future, you know.
Thank you for that.
Is this on? Is that,
yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks so much for the talk. I have a brief comment on democracy and then a question for you. And this goes back to what Alice was saying. I mean, there are many concrete examples of democracies that have dealt with some of these issues, right? We have, I mean, there's hundreds of them. I'll give just one example that I really like, which you can find in the Secwepemc Women's Declaration. The Secwepemc are an indigenous community in what's currently called southwestern British Columbia. And what's really interesting is that their social, legal, and spiritual, it's all kind of one, there's no real distinctions in it, and ecological framework, does not allow them to give consent for anything that would damage the lands or waters for future generations.
Interesting.
So you have this, and this is done democratically. It's done democratically not only between humans to decide, you know, when this might happen, and often in cases where extractive companies are trying to get consent, right? But it's also done with other non-humans and also with future potential humans and past humans, right? So anyway, this is just an example of how, again, going back to Alice's comment, in liberal democracies, we're like, oh my God, we can't do that, but there are examples. Yeah. Okay, on to the question, and it's a relatively quick one. Shoot. At the end, you mentioned that you disagreed with Émile on the issue of keeping consciousness around, essentially. Okay, and I noticed that you used...
Friendly disagreement.
Fair enough. I noticed that you used a quite common metaphor, which is light in the darkness, to describe consciousness. So I think we take consciousness for granted, and also the imagery, the religious imagery, potential racial imagery, etc., around that kind of thinking. Okay, what do you mean by consciousness? I talked about this a bit earlier, but I think maybe it needs a little bit more unpacking in general. Yeah.
Well, okay, so what do I mean by consciousness is a loaded question, but I would take the sort of Žižekian answer, which is that you know, I think consciousness is nature rising to self-awareness, and I think that self-awareness is good in a certain kind of way, and so you know, I do think I think human life is valuable. I think intelligence is value, and I don't mean intelligence in the instrumental race IQ way that Peter Thiel and the Nazis like to use it, but I mean self-aware reflection, human creativity. I think these things have a kind of value. It's not clear that kind of activity exists elsewhere on Earth or elsewhere in the cosmos. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And I think, you know, there's some basic duty to try to preserve it. I don't think that duty is necessarily the overriding duty, right? We could imagine worlds in which the human species would be secured for a long-term future, but that's a future not worth living, right? And so I think, you know, I don't think it's an overriding moral imperative, but I do mean to say that I think preserving human intelligence is a kind of moral aim, not the overriding one, but it is a moral aim that might be in competition with other moral aims we might also hold dear in some kind of way.
Okay, so if I'm a being who fails to meet these requirements, say creativity, intelligence, etc., I don't get to exist in this future. I'm trying to understand where the line is for this, because I'm trying to make a distinction between the eugenicist approaches of many of the Tescuralists and neoliberals and where consciousness comes in. And I don't think personally that the fact that it may not exist elsewhere is, I mean, maybe that's a basis, but I don't see it as a moral one. I see it as sort of a
I mean, so you're making an argument similar to what Claire Colebrook makes, who points out that Ray Brazier, or not Ray Brazier, excuse me, sorry, Ray Brazier, Bostrom, he underlying his politics of existential risk is basically a kind of ableism, right? Because it assumes a certain features as being core to humanity that not everyone possesses. So I agree with what you're saying. I think, though, that although there is certainly a spectrum of like what kind of life has value, most of us do agree that human life has value in some way, however you want to define it. And so I think, I take the point that you're trying to make, which is if you're narrowly isolating intelligence, that can get us on a road to eugenics. And maybe intelligence isn't the right word, because my problem with ChatGPT in particular is that intelligence is more than just a mind in a box, right? Or some code, right? Intelligence is embodied in really important ways. The human is a holistic kind of being that is not just data and numbers, and I find that view really, really, really odious. But I do think humans are special kind of beings that do things other kinds of beings can't, and that I would like it if we were around longer, is basically what my politics boils down to. And I think, again, that doesn't mean that that's the overriding moral imperative. But I do think that's a basic moral aim, right? That can be in competition with other moral aims, and we might need to make decisions about what do we value more, right? And that's really what I'm trying to get at in terms of, that. But thank you. That's a good and important question.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Andre. Did you want to ask?
I do a quick.
Okay, follow.
Are there? I don't know if there are a lot of other questions, but oh, okay. I'll make a comment, a really quick comment, just because I think it fits in this space to make. I'm first of all, Audra had a wonderful interpretation of me, which I love and would like to claim, but also I think pushing farther along this line. If we think of the history, at least in Western ethics, of trying to account for the importance of humanity, it's a pretty dismal story.
Sure.
And the way it's come into the present is often, and this is related to effective altruism and longtermism, is grounded in capacities.
Yeah, sure.
And so I say I may have this in common with Audra as someone who's wanted to, and we have, our supposed great political theorists saying they need to have what I call epicycles, like special addendums, because they think dignity is roughly what Kant thought it was, and it was humanity and rationality. And then you have an addendum to account for people who are comatose or who have disabilities that render them non-linguistic. I have no trouble. I'm just saying this as a moral thinker, looking at someone who's comatose, who doesn't have or lost linguistic ability, and saying that's human. It's a person who has dignity like anyone else. But so I actually get confused by the idea of consciousness as a thing with a value apart from conscious human beings are valuable, but is consciousness valuable? I'm sorry for asking another question.
No, please. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at in terms of I don't think we are intelligences in a box, right? Which is why I think the digital minds thesis is fundamentally odious. People are more than minds. We are minds in a body that extends out into the world, right? And we can exercise creativity and do all sorts of things that other kinds of beings can't. And so I agree that somebody who's comatose is a human being that has value and dignity and deserves to be treated well and have maximal happiness, whatever that might mean in that particular case, right? But at the same time, I think that if you try to radically equalize and say, not everyone's creative, not everyone can be creative, or not everyone has intelligence, or I hear the point you're making, and it's one I'm not attentive to, but at a certain point, we've ceded all ground to make any kind of claim about why human beings might be special. And if you want to argue that we're not special, I think that's totally fine. And I think that's likewise a coherent moral counter-argument, right? But I think at a certain point, you're pointing to a slippery slope that goes one way, which is that if we start valuing these particular things, then do we start saying, well, only people who have a lot of those particular things should live, right? A lot of intelligence or a lot of creativity, et cetera, right? Like we can get down a very dark road. But the flip side is if we aren't willing to say that that humans in aggregate, that the human, there's something that is the human, that is recognizable, that is good in some kind of way. The slippery slope also runs the other way. Then on what grounds should we continue to try to live? And maybe we should just try to minimize suffering in the present until we all die. I mean, that is the flip side of the other side of AGI, right? The mirror image of this is the people, the reverse utilitarians who think all life is suffering and we should all die, right? And like that's the other image of this. And so these are like two sides of the slippery slope, and I think we want to be somewhere in the middle is my view, because I think people are good. I like people, including people who are comatose, and I would like there to be, us for a while. I think that's an aim a lot of us probably share, and I think we should defend it, is how I feel, I mean, that's why we want to solve climate change. We think the Earth is good, and people on the Earth are good, And so, yeah, I agree we have to be careful, but I think we have to be careful in both directions, right? Because the alternative is easily nihilism.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you.
I mean, bear with me, but when you were speaking about the difference between biopower and species power, I started to think about almost the hypothetical example of I get an infection and I exercise biopower by taking an antibiotic to kill it. The species power I had over my gut biome was the unintended consequence of exercising my biopower.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
And it started to make me wonder if almost all examples of species power, at least until these new gods of the terrestrial calamity, has been unintended consequences. And if anything, these dudes are insane in thinking that somehow they could actually exercise conscious, willful species power rather than unintended consequence.
Yeah, no, totally. So I'm a huge fan of Thomas Huxley, who's the grandfather of Julius Huxley. Thomas Huxley compared the eugenics. He's a deep critic of eugenics, really brilliant. Also was somebody who thought in kind of deep political terms about humanity, but thought we would all die eventually, and we should just try to live in a way that would be relatively decent until we all blink out. But Huxley explicitly compared any eugenic projects, but also any projects designed to try to mold the shape of the future human species as pigeons attempting pigeon breeding, right? Like that's how comparatively ridiculous it is. So I totally agree with that, right? But I think there's a spectrum of iterations of species power from, so to give you one example, right? Elon Musk, who is a nut, as we all know, early on in the war in Ukraine, he was supposed to provide satellites to Crimea. And then he pulled out at the last moment because he worried it would help start a nuclear war. That is species power that Musk is exercising, right? He's saying, no, you can't have my Starlink satellites because that might cause a nuclear war. That's a decision he made on behalf of the species as an individual circumventing the foreign policy of nation states. Whatever I might think of that foreign policy, that's an instance of an individual making a claim on behalf of the species. That is doable. Like, people can do stuff like that. Now, ushering in a digital paradise of milk and honey in which there are 10 to the 58 power digital minds, that to me is the pigeons trying pigeon breeding. Yeah. So I think there's a spectrum, and I think, stuff like preventing climate change, I think that's a kind of species power in deep politics that's on the more like manageable end of the spectrum. And then,
But it's mostly from not doing something.
Yes, true. Yeah. Which we're excellent at, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thanks. Yes.
As a practitioner sort of in the field, two things. One, right now what's happening in this, I love the idea at the end about maximal democracy. So when I hear that, what I see is, and I've been involved in this too, having been part of the steering committee for participatory budgeting here in New York City. Cool. So radical participatory systems in America, which is a failed or failing democracy, a plutocracy that passes as a democracy.
Poorly passes.
Yeah. And then other more functioning, partially democratic places. So a lot of this came out of the global south, like participatory budgeting came out of Brazil.
Oh, cool.
And what we're seeing in different places is, depending on the affluence, there's participation fatigue. Who has the labor? I mean, this goes back to like the feminist critique of like unpaid labor. Yeah. So what do we mean by maximal democracy in practical terms? I love the idea, but this sort of, again, like there's this, either it's libertarian or this Burning Man anarchistic idea of like, oh, we can all just do everything together, mutual aid, everything done. It's solved. That comes with all kinds of other problems about who gets left behind when there's no governance. There's no visible power structure. And this is kind of more the Marxist critique of all of that. So that stirs me, but I feel like that's at least a much better debate to have about, returning to that kind of debate. The other thing is, I'm a convert Buddhist, and so for some reason I never thought of this today, thinking about Tescrell and all this other stuff. But like in Buddhism, there's long-termism, there's kalpas and ages and eons, but there the different metaphorical deities are sort of, on one level, kind of like the way I understand it is, they're there to keep humans to inoculate humans from hubris. And I feel like that's so much of what kind of we're missing is when, just even the talk about species and the hubris of that, even in the reaction to the people who are making so many claims about it, I just feel as like part of the way around that is, what about the Andean traditions that have communitarian traditions, more matrilineal traditions? What about the traditions in Asia and other places that are just coming from different places? And I don't know, having been a post-structuralist person in Foucault, and I still really cherish Baudrillard, and I go back to him often, but I'm just like, the answer is pluralism, like radical pluralistic, like let's talk with more people, bring more people on the table. I kind of feel like there's this dead end within this very like narrow Western tradition of just scraps and pieces. So that's more of a reaction. But my question is more the first one.
Yeah, so I want to address the question. Is my mic on? No. It's fine. Thank you. So to address the hubris question, one of my favorite novels, and this might surprise some of you, it's really worth reading, is C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. Before C.S. Lewis wrote Chronicles of Narnia and became famous for that, he was really interested in the question of human extinction